So the sun is doing all this stuff to us. There's absolute scientific proof, but yet where I left you off last week, we don't really have a mechanism that helps us further understand what the heck is going on. So now I want to show you that mechanism. And I'm going to talk about how the idea of a consciousness field exists, linking all biological life together. And we're going to come into this knowledge through the amazing work of Dr. Cleve Backster. You might have heard of him. He's the guy who hooked his plant, his house plant, up to a polygraph lie detector test. Back to the camera here. Backster hooked his plant up to the lie detector test, and then when he thought he was going to burn the plant started to scream. Now, I'll explain what this means, but the point is you're going to see how all this stuff works. So the title of the book is called Primary Perception, back to the slide, Biocommunication with Plants, Living Foods, and Human Cells. And he gets some really, really great endorsements on the back cover here. There's Deepak Chopra, gives a great endorsement, some others. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Dr. Cleve Backster. Here he is as a World War II veteran from 1945, and then here he is posing next to the Dracaena plant that ended up being the source of this amazing experiment. Okay, so Backster is a very interesting character. If you read his book, Primary Perception, one of the things he talks about is hypnotizing the secretary of a high-ranking military official. Under hypnosis, he asked the secretary to go and retrieve a very classified document from one of the file cabinets, which he wasn't even supposed to have. It was outside of his classification, outside of his security level. He hypnotized her. She consented to be hypnotized beforehand. She then went and got the classified document for him. He then brought her out of hypnosis after he'd put it in his suitcase, and she had no memory whatsoever of getting him the document. When she was hypnotized, she would simply do what he asked. So then Backster was crazy enough to take this and go to the guy who was his superior and say, here's this classified document. How did I get it? I got it through hypnosis. They became very concerned. This is immediately after World War II. And they realized that hypnosis could be weaponized and could be used as a military capability, and that this has to be very carefully guarded. So there were many, many books about hypnosis coming out in the early 20th century. It was a big, big obsession. And then after the military realized what they could do with it, they shut it all down. Hypnosis pretty much stopped being talked about. The idea that an ordinary person could be shifted into another state of consciousness where they can perform complex tasks and then not remember doing them when they come out, that's how it all got started. Now, Backster didn't continue in the development of hypnosis technology that much, but unfortunately, he probably had a lot to do with some of the less favorable applications of hypnosis that came out later. In other words, he's the one that turned on the deep state to hypnosis, more or less. Well, that's a very, very heavy amount of karma. And so, having been put in this position of realizing that people could be hypnotized and then they could lie about what they did because they don't even remember doing it, right? He got in a lot of trouble for this. This somehow led to him working on lie detectors. Like, well, okay, let's figure out if somebody's lying. Can we prove if people are lying? Because this is really terrifying. If people are hypnotized, would they be able to remember having done something in the polygraph? Would their body know what they did under hypnosis with a polygraph? So what is a polygraph? It was a new emerging technology at the time. There was no standardized way to measure these types of effects. So Backster himself studied this phenomenon of the electrical activity that is released by any part of your skin. You can detect how much electricity your skin will conduct at any given moment. And you can do this such as, I had these old science kits from Radio Shack when I was in 5th grade, same time I did that light show. And I would go around and build this kit that's a lie detector where you have somebody hold 2 wires and that determines how much electricity your body conducts. So as soon as you start touching the wires, it goes ooh like this. It makes a sound out of the speaker. And then your own level of electrical activity changes the pitch. So even before I knew about Backster, I built one of these out of my science kit. I was like, ooh, lie detector, that sounds great. And I was amazed at how much variability there was in the sound just from holding the wires. And then I actually, because I knew that it was associated with lie detectors, I would try to make myself more agitated. And sure enough, if you can make yourself feel nervous, if you can make yourself sweat a little bit, the pitch goes up. What you're doing is you're analyzing how much electrical activity is in the body. Okay, and you can measure this. Now, in my method, you can measure it with the sound. But another way of doing it is that instead of the pitch going up and down of sound, you have a needle that goes up and down on a graph. So the higher the pitch would be, the higher the needle goes. The lower the pitch would be, the lower the needle goes. Okay, so now what you have is a machine that's sketching out a needle, sketching out a line on a piece of paper. And this is your lie detector test. Well, what happens next? The person who is being tested is hooked up to the lie detector. And then Dr. Cleve Backster is the man who invented the protocol of how to use the lie detector test, believe it or not. So what he discovered was that you want to threaten people and get them nervous, and if you threaten them and get them nervous, and then they respond nervously, that's a good sign that they're lying. So the classic example, and I went to Baxter's lab in San Diego while he was still alive, and he told me this in person. All of a sudden, while the person feels totally relaxed, he would suddenly change his tone of voice, get really angry, and say, "Did you fire the shot that killed your wife?" And then just wait. And even if the person doesn't say anything, if their polygraph starts going, then you know they fired the shot that killed their wife. Why? Because the polygraph gives you an easy way to detect nervousness. The polygraph essentially is a nervousness detector. Now, some people can beat polygraphs. Not everybody is going to feel nervous if they're lying or if they're confronted about the possibility of lying. Some people have convinced themselves that their lies are true and they believe it so much that they can fool a polygraph. But for the most part, polygraphs are reliable. So what Backster did then is to totally standardize the whole system of the types of interview questions, how you gauge, how severe of a reaction you got, quantifying that into a number, and then being able to create a statistical map of how likely it is that that person is lying. That's what he was doing. Now, up until this point, when he's doing all this work, you would think, okay, well, a human being, right? A human being is going to have complex electrical activity. When a human being gets nervous, they're going to have more nervous-looking graph. That could be no different than a brainwave, the same kind of idea. What about plants? Well, this was a very strange thing where just on the spur of the moment, going back to the slide now, as you see on the right, it says author and Dracaena plant. So this is a Dracaena cane plant. And if they're allowed to grow in the jungles or equatorial regions, they'll get big and they'll have big leaves and a big trunk. His plant never got that big, but what he found was that with these kind of waxy, thick leaves that this plant had, he could actually hook up electrodes to the plant's leaf. And much to his amazement, the plant's electrical activity was equally as complex as that of a human being. The plant's electrical activity is never a flat line like this. It's always doing all this crazy stuff. And this literally is a measurement of how well an electrical current will pass through the entire plant. You could do it on one leaf, you could do it on the top and the bottom, doesn't matter. The entire plant is doing these electrical things. Now, first of all, plants are supposedly primitive. We would never expect a plant to have such complex, dancing, nonstop electrical activity. Here again is a picture of the historic original Dracaena plant. Now you'll notice on the right, on the leaf that's on the bottom on the right, you'll notice there's a little piece clipped off and it's a straight line there. Well, that's because that's the tip of the leaf that he burned. So this is where the story gets very interesting. First of all, let's take a look at this. This is the very, oh geez, did it again. I got to not hit that button. I have a different remote today. So this is the historic graph of the first 2 minutes when he hooked up this plant to the polygraph. And what you see here is that there's a very complex lifelike activity. Now, in the beginning, because you're going from left to right, you see that the graph is trending downwards, and then you see there's a big, big line, and he draws arrows on it. That's because he had to move the needle into a position that was comfortable for the plant. So it was actually cranked up too high for the plant. He had to raise the needle up so it didn't go off the paper. Then you get this incredibly complex graph that's all human-like. It's exactly like what we would see with a human being. So then as time goes on, we get into the second part of the graph. He's watching this and he says, well, you know, this plant is behaving just like a human being, and its output is just like a human being on a lie detector. So what do we do to get a reaction on the polygraph? We have to threaten the person. Could I threaten this plant and cause the plant to have a reaction similar to a human being? In other words, if I burn a leaf of the plant, will the plant have a reaction? Now, you would expect, well, yeah, of course, if the plant's got a human-like reaction and then you set it on fire, at the moment that you burn the leaf, the plant should be screaming. But yet, what is so unbelievable in this graph is that at the moment that he got the idea to burn the leaf, that's when the plant started screaming. Because apparently it could see the future and it knew he was going to do it. So when you see this graph here, right at that point where we're now going to the next page, so let's just start here. So right where the graph just surges, you see that, how it's all kind of going along on one line, and then all of a sudden off to the right it surges? That's the exact moment that he got the idea in his mind to burn the leaf. And then the same graph continues forward here. All of this crazy, crazy screaming that you see how the graph is just like so intense and so crazy. The plant is just screaming and screaming and screaming. And he didn't actually burn the leaf until almost in the middle, just a little bit to the left of the middle. So all that original screaming is before the plant had any actual physical evidence that he was going to hurt it. And then he started to feel really bad after he burned the leaf, because clearly, if this was a human being, this is a person who's like crying now and hyperventilating and sweating and in a very, very agitated state. So he actually felt bad. He has an attack of conscience and he says, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to hurt you anymore. I'm going to take the matches, I'm going to leave the room, and I'm not going to burn you again. And right after he did that, as you see in this graph, that's when the plant calms back down. The plant somehow intelligently knew that he was going to burn it before he actually carried out the behavior. This is crazy. This is telepathy. It doesn't make any sense, except that the plant was telepathic, and then it knew that he was going to burn it, and it knew when he had decided not to burn it anymore. Well, believe it or not, he never burned another plant again. He didn't want to replicate the experiment because he started to feel really sorry for plants, because they're having emotions. This is an emotional reaction, you see. Now, a plant doesn't have eyes. It doesn't have a nose or a mouth or arms or legs. And even vegetarians typically will very carelessly throw boiling water onto vegetables. They don't think about the vegetables screaming when they boil the vegetables. Well, Backster discovered that if you pray over the plant, if you pray over it, if you actually send it love for just a few seconds, then if the plant is cooked for your food, it doesn't scream. Plants apparently know that they are here to feed us, and if you tell them that that's what you want to do, then it doesn't scream. So I find it ironic that vegetarians think they have a cruelty-free diet, but they're making plants scream every day. And they have no idea that the plant is screaming. And they don't even care. So it's a very bizarre situation, isn't it? And I remember talking, I had a real estate person when I was in Kentucky, and I was getting my place in Kentucky in this tiny little town called Milton. I lived in a little 3-bedroom house. It was basically a double-wide trailer, but built into the ground. And as I was lining up that deal, I had a realtor lady there, and I was talking to her about this. And her little daughter, literally halfway through me telling the story of Cleve Backster, when she heard all the things I just told you, she runs out the door. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? So I kind of like get up and go out, and the little girl is rolling around in the grass, and she's going, you can hear me. You can hear me. And it's true. It's true. Sorry about that. So here's the electrodes that he hooked up to this plant to get this plant to show these life reactions. Now, some very strange things started to happen. So he's not going to burn the plant again, okay? But like, for example, he gets really interested in seeing what these plants are going to do and how they're going to intelligently react to what happens in his office in San Diego. And so at one point, the plants just start totally freaking out. All four of them. He had four, I think it was four of them that were all hooked up at the same time. They all start screaming. He's like, what the hell is going on? And so, well, is there anybody here who isn't normally going to be here? Well, yeah. It turns out that they were having some landscaping done, and that the guy who mows lawns was in the building, a mass murderer as far as the plants are concerned, right? Because what's he doing all day? He's chopping down grass. When the lawn mowing guy was in the building, the plants couldn't stop screaming because they were afraid he was going to mow them as well. They're not intelligent enough to understand that whatever death he was causing wasn't going to be brought to them. So again, this is a very, very fascinating discussion. There was another, as the thing expanded, he started to find out that there were other phenomena that would work. So for example, he went to an Ivy League university, actually picked some of the ivy off the outside of the building, brought it in, hooked it up to the polygraph, and of course he gets the lifelike reaction. So then somebody got the idea to mess around with a spider. So what they had was a spider, and they put the spider on the table, and then Backster put his hands around the spider while everybody is watching the polygraph up on a screen. At the moment that he let go, so he's got his hands around the spider, so the spider feels trapped. At the moment that he lets go of his hands around the spider has this incredible surge of fear before it starts to run for its life. Because basically, if it's got hands around it and it runs for its life, it assumes it's going to get squished. So the spider doesn't know whether it should stop moving or whether it should run. It's in fight or flight. At the exact moment that the spider has the fight or flight response, the ivy from the outside of the Ivy League school starts screaming with the spider. So nature is integrated with itself in terms of how these things work. That if a spider is nervous, the plants are nervous. Okay, that's really, really strange. And if somebody's a lawnmower, the plants are very nervous, apparently. It's a mass murderer, for God's sake. There was another example that he told me about in person where they had these flatworms called platyhelminths, if you remember that. And I remember Miss Nolan, my sophomore year biology teacher, calling them platyhelminths so you could remember that they were flatworms. Well, the weird thing about a platyhelminths is that you can chop it up with a razor blade and then it grows back whatever it lost. So there's been a lot of weird experiments that have been done with that. So then Backster had an experiment where he hooked up a platyhelminth worm to his electrodes, and the worm started to have responses to other things in its environment. And I forget exactly what it responded to. So then there was a skeptic there, and the skeptic said, I don't believe any of this. This is all bullshit. You're full of it. None of this is real. Backster says, oh yeah, watch this. Because you have to do things spontaneously. This is another funny part. If the plants know that you're going to try to trick them, they don't get scared. They only get scared if you fool them into believing it's real. So what Backster did is this guy is watching this one platyhelminth wired up on the polygraph. He says, watch this. He takes the jar of all the other platyhelminths and he shakes it really hard, which of course injures them, traumatizes them. They're all very, very upset now. What do you think happened on the graph? The platyhelminthi that was wired up starts screaming as all of his buddies are being hurt in the glass. That's really amazing. So he gets all these very, very high quality. Oh, another really strange thing. Over and over again in his lab, he started to notice that the plants would scream, and he didn't know why. And there was no seeming explanation for this. But then as this kept happening, he noticed that every time the plants would scream, there was a flushing noise. And so they were on the other side of where the men's bathroom was. Well, it turns out that the male urinals had these blue cookie things in them that smell bad, and they have a toxic poison in them that kills microbes. And it turns out that all human beings pass a certain amount of microbial living bacteria in our urines, just part of being human. As the living bacteria would hit the cakes in the urinals, they would start screaming, "Oh, David, man, now I got to bless every time I take a leak." Yeah, I guess so. Sorry about that. Bless the urinal, man, because your urine is screaming as it hits that cake. And the plants picked up on it. And he was able to replicate this. You could anticipate the sound of the urinal flushing by watching the plants in advance. So this is a very, very peculiar effect. And he starts to talk about this, and he gets a lot of feedback that's bad. And the feedback is, well, this is not scientific. It's an effect. It's the Backster effect. It's not replicable. You can't replicate this in a lab. So Backster says, well, yeah, I think I can. So what he did is he created this horrific torture device where these brine shrimp, which he believed were the most expendable creature he could find, were then dumped completely at random into a pot of boiling water. So what you see here is this very exotic, I mean, this is real World War II type of stuff. He built his own machine. I mean, God bless him, right? He built his own cup dumping machine in which there's 3 cups that have live brine shrimp in them. And at a certain point, those at totally random intervals, these cups are going to turn over and dump the shrimp into the boiling hot water where they scream and die. And he said that he felt that the brine shrimp was probably the most expendable living thing that he could think of that wouldn't get the nature lovers totally upset with him for doing this. I've still had people at conferences when I present this get upset about it anyway. So now what you're seeing is a diagram of his lab, and sure enough, I went into the lab, and this is an accurate diagram of the lab. You have 3 plants connected to wires, as you can see, distributed throughout the lab, and then the wires are linked up to machines in what he's calling this instrument room. So you have 4 polygraphs in the room, 3 of which are hooked up to these plants. And then way over onto the far side, you have the dump dish device and you have the programmer. Sure enough, it was able to be done that when the brine shrimp were dumped into the boiling water, the plants would scream. However, there's a very important caveat to this. The plants lose interest in the death of the brine shrimp if there's other people around. They seem to go with the consensus of the life that's around them and how close it is and what that life is feeling. So this experiment didn't really work very well, if at all, during the day when there were people in the building. It required you to do it at night when nobody was there except for the programmer. As you can see, he's located on the bottom right. Back to the slide. It says programmer in that rectangle down there. So if the plants are alone and cold and scared at night and there's no humans around to keep them safe, then they might get worried about the death of the brine shrimp. But during the day, if there's people around and the people aren't worried about it, the plants don't care at all. That's very, very interesting. Then he finally got the idea one day, what if I can take a regular organic egg, or maybe inorganic, I don't know if it's organic or not, but just a regular chicken egg out of the refrigerator and hook it up to the polygraph. What do we get? Well, the first thing that he noticed here, using galvanic skin response, is that the egg had, and this is an unfertilized, by the way, this is oh, David, man, Now you're going to make me never want to eat eggs again. You ass. How could you do this to me? I'm sorry, but you need to know so that you will bless your eggs so that they don't scream when you're making breakfast. Okay? And these were non-fertilized eggs, the same ones that you get out of the refrigerator if you have eggs in the refrigerator. So back to the slide. A very, very strange heartbeat showed up. Yeah, I'm telling you, it has a heartbeat, okay? Your little egg in the refrigerator already has an electrical heartbeat, which suggests that it's alive, of course. And then he was like, well, what if it's a brainwave? Let me hook it up to an electrocardiogram or an EKG, right? Sure enough, when he tested the egg for brainwaves, it had this very strange, very rhythmic brainwave pattern as if it was in a coma, like it's asleep, because of course it hasn't been fertilized, it hasn't grown into a chicken yet. But even then, it actually has brainwaves. Holy crap. Did you hear about this before? I don't think anybody's heard about this before, unless you heard it from me. Then look at this. Then he uses the EEG, the electroencephalogram, which is a more detailed brainwave measurement. And then what he found was different cycles of activity that are even. So there's these different pulse rates coming out of the egg. And if you look here, I can identify easily 4 different pulse rates, just based on the lines that he drew. And he either draws a circle, so there's 2 circles on the bottom, there's 1 circle on the top that keeps popping up in a cyclical even rhythm. And then there's those squares going down the middle. So each of these things keep appearing at the same speed. And again, this is a regular chicken egg. So the regular chicken egg has different cycles of brainwave activity going at different speeds that all kind of superimpose over each other. And that's very, very interesting. So sure enough, he had the chicken egg wired up on the electroencephalogram, and then this is the moment at which he picked up his little kitty. Yeah, that's Sammy boy. That's Sammy the Siamese. And Sammy is very unhappy right now. You can see his claws are out. His eyes are crazy. He is not happy. But this is because Cleve refused to let go of him after picking him up because he was asleep. The cat was asleep when he got picked up, and then he startled and he got all scared. And once we see what happens on the egg, he's like, that's it. I'm not even letting the cat down. We got to take a picture of this moment right as it happened. So as little Sammy gets woken up and he's terrified, that's the exact moment on the chicken egg that was nearby the cat. Right at the moment that the cat got picked up, the chicken egg screamed. So apparently if your animal gets startled out of a deep sleep, or if some kind of negative stuff goes on, or if you're in an argument in your house, your eggs are screaming. They don't like it. Isn't this weird? This is the kind of data that got my career started. This is the data that I was presenting on stage back in 2007 or 6 even, that led to me moving to Los Angeles, and because I was told, if you make a film about this, it's going to be absolutely amazing. So chicken eggs are screaming when cats get scared? Yeah, because nature is listening. And when something gets freaked out, just like with the brine shrimp dying, or the bacteria dying on the cake in the urinal, or the guy coming in who had just mowed lawns, plants don't like that. They don't like violence. They don't like anger. And so you might not realize the influence that you might be having on your own houseplants. In other words, they are very attuned to you. When you are upset, they are upset at the same time. And this is another thing that Backster found. Plants imprint on the person who waters them. So he has it's anecdotal, but there's plenty of data to suggest that if you are bonded with a certain plant, and then you go out traveling, that your house plant is actually still emotionally connected to you and still responding to you regardless of how far away you are. When you get upset, your plant gets upset. So they really do need our help. And I feel bad because I used to be such a workaholic. I wouldn't water my plants, and my plants wouldn't do very well. Sometimes they'd even lose leaves, and I got to always remember, now lately in the last year or so, I've been really good with my plants, but I had to really tune into nature and remember this stuff, and remember that nature is alive and nature is listening. And if I'm watering this plant and something bad happens to me, the plant feels bad for me. Well, here's another really weird one, which is totally expected, right? What he's got now is one of the chicken eggs that he brought out of the refrigerator, and then he starts throwing all his little buddies into the boiling hot water. And so right in the middle of the graph there is the moment that he starts throwing the eggs into the water. Well, a different egg is now wired up, and you can see on the left it only had that comatose brainwave. No, the chicken egg gets knocked out of its coma when his little buddies start being boiled up for your breakfast. Each of the circles on those peaks are the exact moments that each of 4 eggs was dropped into the boiling water. Okay? There is no other explanation for this except that the egg is screaming when the other eggs are being dropped in the boiling water. But again, if this is starting to make you feel guilty, just bless the darn stuff. So I always bless my meal. Even if it's a silent blessing, I put my hands over the plate, I pray on it, and I just say, boom, we're done. And all you need is 3 seconds, and that's it. This won't happen. But if you don't do that, this is going to happen. I would hope that if you had a prayerful attitude where you're preparing food, that it's working on its own, even if you weren't consciously doing this before. But just to be on the safe side, let's do this from now on. So now here's another example of a weird egg effect, except in this case, he had an African violet that was hooked up to his polygraph, and you see it has a complex activity. At the moment that he got the idea to break an egg, he hadn't actually done it yet, but he committed to it in his mind. As you look on this graph, at the exact moment he got the idea to break an egg, his African violet started screaming in empathy for the egg before it was even actually broken. So nature is very worried about any type of problems or disasters that are going on. And if you think about it, as eggs in the nest are being attacked, the eggs that are not dead yet are going to be screaming, and the mother will hear the screaming. So the mother bird is called back to the nest if some of the eggs get damaged. So what we've caught in action here is a natural mechanism. And I believe animals are much more capable of hearing these signals from nature than people usually are. Well, as Backster kept working on this, then he gets into the idea, well, how about just straight bacteria? How could we work bacteria and just kind of get them into something that we could use for testing? Well, he discovered, going to the slide, sure enough, yogurt they brag about it, right? Billions and billions of microorganisms. Well, that's great. Stick some electrodes in that stuff. Let's see what happens. Well, here we have friendly bacteria reacting to the agitation of unfriendly bacteria, and sure enough, the bacteria is screaming when other bacteria are killed. And then we have another example of friendly bacteria continually reacting to agitation of unfriendly bacteria, and he was killing the bacteria with the antibiotics. So then it says, this is an example of yogurt responding to vodka and tonic. So at this exact moment, he threw the vodka and tonic into this yogurt, and the plant starts screaming. Now, I think this is the same incident that's depicted here. Let's see this, because it said February 26, 1996. Oh no, this is a different one. Okay. So this is again yogurt responding to other yogurt being killed by vodka. Right? So think about you want to feel even more guilty now? When you drink alcohol, how many bacteria are dying in your gut? Billions. Okay, so you got to bless your gut bacteria as you drink alcohol. Most people aren't thinking of that, right? So then later on in 1996, let's go to the slide now. Yeah, okay. So here they are. He's got a meeting of what looks like 5 people sitting there. In the next slide, you'll see all 5 of them. It's May 26, 1996. And look at this guy over on the right. He's a skeptic. He doesn't believe any of this Cleve Backster stuff. F you. You don't know what the hell you're doing, man. But what we're seeing is, this is a video, and he showed me the original. Okay, I've seen the original video. It's a split screen, and on the bottom, of course, as you can see, is the polygraph. And it's drawing what's happening to the yogurt that's sitting in the room as all these people are talking. And again, these effects are spontaneous. If the yogurt knows that you're going to try to scare it, it won't scream. is, you're trying to fool me. I don't. So what you have to do is kind of like catch the yogurt off guard and surprise it with something violent that it doesn't like. So in this case, while these people are talking and this guy's got his arms crossed and he's a skeptic, Backster spontaneously goes in front of the camera that's filming them, has a vial of yogurt, and then hits it with an antibiotic as they're talking. So this is the beginning, first slide. And then this is, look at the guy now. Look at the dork who was like, I don't believe you. Now he's on the edge of his seat. He's, whoa. Because, and I watched the original. At the exact moment, you can actually watch the film. At the exact moment that he drops the antibiotic into the yogurt that's on the polygraph just goes, oh, and it has this, you can see that it's dying. You can see that yogurt is dying because it has this kind of, this death instantaneously. I mean, the second that stuff hits the yogurt, it goes, oh. And so here's the full graph from that. Of the tracing of the yogurt reacting to the antibiotic. It's very visually stunning if you see the original. Hopefully we can track that down. So as of 2002, he had never ever cut that plant or burned it again, and it just kept growing and growing. So that's the original Dracaena cane plant that he had worked on in 1968, now in 2002. And I got to see the plant, hold the plant. It was starting to die. It was starting to not do very well, but it was just so huge. But again, that just shows the impact that this had. So Backster got really famous in the 1970s, and I remember my mother telling me about a guy who was burning plants and that they screamed as he was burning them. And so he was on like Merv Griffin, all these shows that were popular back then. He went all over the place talking about this. But going back to the slide, the Backster effect has obvious implications when it comes to telepathic communication. Let's go here now. It appears that everybody is very interested in what everybody else is doing. And so Backster took it to the final frontier, which was human cells. And what he found was that you could swish around water in your mouth, and when you expectorate or spit, you have a little bit of leukocytes or white blood cells that are naturally occurring in your saliva. They emanate from your gums and they keep your mouth clean. So these little leukocytes are alive. And so one of the ways that he could test human cells was to simply have people spit into this tiny, tiny little vial, and then he had two tiny, tiny gold wires that he put into the vial. So now what you have is, if you keep the thing cool, the human cells will stay alive actually for several hours. And during that time, they're actually giving out an EKG, which you can measure. So at one point, Backster had lots of interesting things happen when he started to study human cells. He also tried sperm cells from men at one point. There was one point when he had a man donate sperm cells. I got to be really careful how I talk about this. And then after he donated the sperm cells, he showed him a Playboy magazine that had the Bo Derek pictorial from the movie 10, which again, she was the hot thing back then. So as the man was told to open the magazine, his sperm cells started screaming and going crazy. And then when he was instructed by Backster to close the magazine, the cells calmed back down. And then Backster said, "Would you please take one finger and touch the Playboy magazine again?" And as the man touched the Playboy magazine again, his sperm cells started screaming again. That's really funny. In the case of Dr. Brian O'Leary, you have a NASA astronaut who donates his spit in the lab and then flies back to Phoenix. And I got to meet him in 2009, Dr. Brian O'Leary, and talk to him about this when we were together in Switzerland for the Project Camelot event out there. So, and sadly, he died not too long after that. I never got to speak to him again, but I was glad that I did. And so what happened was that Dr. O'Leary donated this sample in the lab. This was spit, not sperm. And then he flies for 300 miles back to Phoenix. Along the way, he had a journal, and they synchronized watches, and every time something bad happened to him, he would write it down at the exact time that it happened based on what his watch says. Okay, well, somebody almost cut me off. I'm all pissed off. I'm supposed to be taking this exit. This guy cut me off. So every time that something really emotional, upsetting happened to him, he wrote it down. And then they went back and they compared his written notes to the polygraph from his cells in San Diego. And wouldn't you know, every time that he got upset, his cells in San Diego, 300 miles away, were screaming. And also, there doesn't appear to be any distance factor in this type of phenomenon because Dr. Edgar Mitchell, actually conducted successful telepathy experiments on the moon with telepathic senders who were on Earth. So we have never been able to find any theoretical distance to how far this genetic information would travel. But when we get it into the realm of human cells and the idea that our own cells are screaming as we're doing things in the world, this is very fascinating. Our plants are attuned to us, nature is attuned to us, but we seem to kind of control the flow of how nature feels. If we feel good, the nature around us feels good and vice versa. So if nature is this complex, if it's having this much communication with us, then this leads itself to the distinct possibility that we have a method for telepathic communication to actually be happening. In other words, we've already identified a mechanism. We've already identified interspecies communication that is directly measurable by the EEG and the EKG and the polygraph. There's no rational explanation for this effect, and again, the dump cup brine shrimp experiment has been successfully replicated, but you have to do it when there's no people around, or else the plants don't care about the death of the shrimp. So this has so many implications. It goes in so many different directions because, again, you have to fool the plant. The plant knows if you're really going to hurt it or not. So this is ironic. This is a true story. When I moved to LA, we started working on a movie called Convergence, which we still haven't made. Hopefully I'll get it made in the future, now that we're going to get some budget from the other stuff we're doing with aerospace. So when I was producing this movie, and I guess it was around 2008 or somewhere like that, 2007, we did a film shoot in Los Angeles. We did it at the UCLA. Or no, it was USC. We did it at USC. And so we had a film shoot where we blew $80,000 in 2 days. And that was terrifying just in and of itself because I'm the star of the show, so I have to perform. And we brought in Cleve Backster, and we filmed him in the classroom. And we set up a fake classroom situation where he was lecturing to this class. Now, Backster is not an actor. Baxter's a real guy. So in the script, I'm there as myself. There's a teacher who's an actress. And then we have some students from USC who were extras, and they were sitting in the seats acting as students in this class. Baxter there's a student in the class who is supposed to hear about Backster saying that plants will scream if you try to burn them. And in our shoot, this kid is supposed to get up and want to run over and burn the plant. And then the plant is supposed to scream. And I'm supposed to hold the kid back and restrain him from burning the plant. We wanted to make a dramatic scene. Well, the kid did what he was supposed to do, but then Backster is not acting. Backster is not doing what we need, and we got $80,000 on the line, and Backster is not pretending that the plant is screaming. We did like 2 or 3 takes of this, and the plant isn't doing anything. So I'm getting mad now. I'm like, my actor is not performing. So then we're doing the 4th take, and I got to restrain the kid again. I said, I know what I need to do now. Baxter's only going to react if the plant really screams. Now, how do I get the plant to really scream? At the moment that I restrained the kid, who was an actor, so he wasn't really wanting to burn the plant, so the plant was smart enough to know that, right? At the moment that the kid is thinking he's going to burn the plant, I sent just the most crazy anger and like, I am going to smash you, I am going to burn you, I am going to throw you on the ground, I'm going to rip you apart. And I hated this plant. And I just sent, because I'm like, you got to do something, buddy. We're going to lose the whole shoot. $80,000 is on the line here. And I go, ugh, and I throw this at the plant. And the plant just starts screaming, and then Backster on camera goes, "Whoa, we got a real reaction here." Well, that was from me. I did it. And there was another point during the shoot where our director we wanted to set up a camera over the polygraph so you could film the polygraph going. And they just couldn't get the darn camera to work. And so our director, sometimes directors can get pretty frosty. Our director started basically yelling at the kid with the camera saying, "Why isn't it working?" and all this kind of stuff. And the kid started getting really upset, and I was right there. Every time she started going after him, the plant was screaming right as he was obviously visibly upset on his face. And I'd seen that already, so now I know, okay, I just gotta hit this plant with some negative energy. And that's what I did, and it worked. So I have personally verified that this works with Cleve Backster, with his plant, with his polygraph, in a film shoot that I was doing, which we still have never released. I have a guy in LA who's got the footage. I'm going to get that footage so you can see it in the future. So this is very fascinating. I've had personal experience with this. And again, if you didn't have a plant hooked up to a polygraph, you might not know this was happening. Incidentally, the people in Italy who did Damen, they have come up with a device that actually takes the sounds of the plant and makes it musical, either chromatic scale, which is all the white and black keys, or you can make it diatonic. So there is a machine out there. I don't know if other people are making them besides Damen. I just know about theirs, but you can. I've been in cases where we have a plant wired up, and you can hear what the plant is doing, and the plant absolutely responds to everybody else in the room as you meditate. It's a very fascinating thing because in the beginning, when people are getting settled and they're not that into it, the plant's just, it's doing all this stuff. And then once everybody starts meditating, the plant just settles on a couple tones and it just stays really beautiful and it starts making music. It's incredible. So this is real. And it's just another way to scratch the surface of a much, much deeper issue, which is, how did all these ancient texts get written? How did divine beings reach humans and communicate to them in ways that were then written down where they then become scripture? Is it possible that there are real beings that are a higher intelligence than humans now, and that for them, the telepathic communication is no different than the little girl running out and rolling around in the grass going, "You can hear me, you can hear me"? The beings know whether you're for real or not, just like the plants know. But the beings actually are doing a lot more than just responding to a disaster in the case of the plants. I believe that we are being guided and steered. And so if you hear the phone ring and you didn't look at the caller ID and you're like, "Oh, that might be my mother," and sure enough, it's your mother, that's telepathy. Okay? There's lots and lots of laboratory experiments of human telepathy that prove that it does work. My favorite one is the experiment where you have somebody sitting in a room and they are told nothing except to read magazines. They don't know what's going on. There's a hidden camera in the room, and that person who's told to read the magazines is hooked up to a polygraph once again. Then you have someone in another room, because remember, when Backster did this polygraph research, lots of other scientists took it and did a lot of other stuff with it. So there's many, many different types of research into this polygraph phenomenon. In this particular case, the person's wired up to the polygraph, they're looking at magazines, they don't even know there's a hidden camera in the room. Then you have someone in a completely separate room, and they are instructed, they have a closed circuit TV in the room where they can see the person on camera who's sitting in the room looking at magazines. Then they're told, "We want you to stare intently at this person, but only when we tell you. But when we tell you, we want you to stare intently at them like you're really, really focusing on them and you really want to get their attention." Every time that the person is being stared at, even though there is no possible way they could know it, their entire body shows signs of excitation. So what does this reveal? This reveals that you are getting the telepathic signals, you just don't listen to them. The person in the room did feel some kind of agitation when they were being stared at, but they didn't know why, and they didn't know where it was coming from, and they didn't even pay attention to it. Now, what I'm arguing is that you can learn to pay attention to this stuff. You can learn to sense when somebody's staring at you, and a lot of times we do. How many times have you felt that and then you turn and sure enough somebody's looking at you? That's true. It's real. It works. So we're not able to listen most of the time. That person in the room reading the magazines isn't aware that their cells are screaming, but they are. Same process. Well, it's not just screaming, it could actually be complex information. And so this just gives an overview of why something like remote viewing might work. Now, remote viewing started in the 1970s with government research into the possibility of humans being able to see a remote location and describe it accurately, psychically. Well, if you've ever heard about remote viewing, then you know that it's been declassified, it's been officially acknowledged that this was done, it does exist, and we know that remote viewing produces 99% accurate results once you have properly trained viewers. In other words, only 1 out of 100 sessions of remote viewing won't get the target. Now, how does remote viewing actually work? You pick a particular target of where you want someone to go and describe that location. It could be a location here, it could be a location off planet, it doesn't matter. Then you assign 2 random numbers to this target, and those are called coordinates. Now, you're the only person who knows what those numbers correspond to. You take the 2 numbers, you write them on a piece of paper, you put them in an envelope, and then you hand them to somebody else. This is called double blind. That somebody else is a guide who then guides the remote viewer on those coordinates. The guide doesn't know what the coordinates are, and the remote viewer doesn't know what the coordinates are. That's double blind. Nobody knows what these numbers correspond to. But the intelligent information field of the universe does, right? If the universe is alive and conscious, the envelope has consciousness in it. The envelope knows what's going on. So as you actually take the coordinates and you run them through the remote viewer with this process, the remote viewer will accurately describe the site that those coordinates correspond to. Now, I ended up getting to talk to Pete Peterson about this, and he was involved in this remote viewing research, and what he told me was that in the beginning, everybody was getting voices talking to them, and the voices appeared to be from positive, angelic, extraterrestrial humans. They didn't want this. So what they did is they redesigned the whole protocol where you're not allowed to listen to voices, you're not allowed to write down speech, you're only allowed to look for a particular target on land. You might get a few words here and there associated with the target, but you're not allowed to just take dictation on some sort of angelic voice that's talking, because what they discovered was, there's real positive angelic extraterrestrials, and when people open up like this, the angelic extraterrestrials want to use them to bring through messages. It's just that the military didn't want anything to do with that, right, at the time, which is sad. But I ended up going into the remote viewing protocols and immediately modified them to be able to pick up speech. In other words, I took the basic guidelines of remote viewing, which I describe all that in my new book, Awakening the Dream, how to do it. So if you don't know how to do remote viewing, I would highly recommend getting my new book because I teach you how it works. To really, really simplify it, you want to be in a deep state of meditation, you don't analyze the information, and you don't have any emotional reaction to it. Your body can't be hungry, tired, thirsty, anything like that. And you can't have sadness, anger, the only thing you can have is uplifting, positive feelings, okay? So this is the basic protocol of remote viewing. The universe is alive, and the universe is made from a conscious energy source, and the research all shows us, this is science now. The universe is made from a conscious, living energy source that can actually think for itself. And this living intelligence binds us all together. So we are all unified in consciousness. We all share a unified consciousness field.